Good afternoon. We are very pleased to have in the Fundación Ramón Areces in this high quality and cozy venue. Thank you, Daniel, for your words. And thank you for hosting us and for having our keynote speaker, Jill Jones, in the 9th International Workshop on Efficiency in Education, Health and Public Services. I want to introduce briefly Jill, my friend Jill. Over her 35-year career, Jill Jones, professor of production economics, have been involved in teaching, research and leadership. She holds a Pilkington Teaching Award from Lancaster University many years ago, and a National Teaching Fellowship from her Higher Education Academy. She has an established international research record in the field of higher education efficiency and has advised various national and international bodies. Jill has used her experience in teaching and research in her role as Dean of Huddersfield Business School, which she held until January of this year, 2023. The school's growing reputation is demonstrated by rising international rankings and successful accreditation journeys, including the Small Business Charter 2022, the Association to Advance College Schools of Business 2023, and shortlisting 4 times higher Business School of the Year 2023. Congratulations, Jill. Whilst Dean, Jill has diversified the school's portfolio, including developing a strong business engagement agenda through placement, consultancy, degree apprenticeship, executive education courses, and knowledge transfer partnerships. The most important. She has personally been involved in the production of the Careless Top 100 Companies list and is on the Yorkshire and Humber Leadership Board of Business in the community. She continues this agenda in her part-time role now as Director of External Engagement. Well, now a short introduction for our conversation. Approaching to the end of the fruitful career of Jill Jones, she is going to reflect today with us on her own and colleagues' related research in the context of performance measurement in higher education, her findings, which is more important, her recommendations. Using England and the UK as a case study, she is going to evaluate how much the research has fed into performance evaluation before recounting the experience within one university of top-down application of performance measurement. She ends by considering what more could and should be done in this research area. Definitely, where does our research go from here? The UK is not alone in the challenge it has faced in funding a rapidly expanding higher education sector, and there are many lessons for other countries, including Spain, in the experiences and research that Jill Jones presents today in this house, in the foundation. The floor is yours, Jill. Sorry. Very briefly, our first question is, why did you become interested in university efficiency, Jill?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, Carmen. So, first of all, please can I thank the organising committee for this 9th workshop on efficiency in education and other public sector organisations for inviting me to speak here today. Many thanks in particular to Carmen, to Ava and to Ruben, the local organisers, and to the Foundation for their financial support. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you today. So, to go to your question then, Carmen, why did I become interested in measuring university efficiency? It's going to be a little bit of a history lesson to begin with. So, let me start by going back to a key moment, 1963, about 20 years before my career actually started, and the publication of the Robbins Report in the UK, as I think this is really what led to the context of when I started my career 20 years later. At that time in the UK, there were around 30 universities with only 4% of the relevant age group entering university. It was a highly elite system, and much more so than many other countries. The Robbins Report was seminal. It emphasised that there was considerable untapped talent in British society caused by this elitism, and that this was not only inequitable, but was also highly detrimental to the performance of the British economy. Robbins recommended the expansion of higher education, proposing that universities should be open to all who are qualified for them by ability and attainment to pursue them, and who wish to do so. So, when I started my academic career in 1985, we were really feeling the effects of the implementation of this Robbins recommendation. The UK higher education sector had certainly expanded. There were 50 universities, largely funded through the taxpayer, and at that stage, around 14% of school leavers were going to university. But it still looked very different from what we see today. The problem with Robbins was that he had triggered this much-needed expansion in higher education, but he hadn't put in place the financial structures to pay for it, and those were yet to come. As the 1980s progressed, the pressure on public finances caused by the oil crises of the 1970s and the funding cuts to higher education that accompanied these led to a call by the government for universities to become much more accountable to the taxpayer. And it's no coincidence that the economic conditions which motivated the development of performance assessment in England and the UK had a similar effect in Spain. Democratization of the internal structures of Spain's universities in the 1980s was accompanied by new systems for assessing, teaching, and research performance of academic staff. So back to the UK, there had been considerable media as well as government interest in UK performance indicators in the 1970s, and the Financial Times regularly published league tables of universities based on their so-called performance in certain key areas of interest to the taxpayer and to prospective students, such as labour market destinations of graduates, student completion rates, and graduate achievement rates. So, it was at this point that I stepped into the research field as a PhD student researching into performance indicators in higher education, and this was subsequently published as a book in 1990. My supervisor, Professor Jim Taylor, had been working in this area, trying to convey the idea to policymakers that performance isn't just about outcomes, and that's a message that I've been hearing in many of the presentations that I've sat through today. A fair comparison between universities can only be done by taking into account the inputs used as well. Jim obtained some funding, which would bring in a PhD student, and of course that PhD student was me. Jim had also been joined in his research by a young economist called Geraint Johns. And my PhD built on their work. And it's these two academics that had the most influence on me as I started out in my academic career. And of course, Geraint, now Professor Emeritus at Lancaster University, he had no idea I was going to do this, and it's amazing seeing his face as he sits there. So Geraint has been a huge support to me throughout my career. There are great benefits to being married to one of the best researchers in your own field of research, one of which is being able to continue the research discussions over the dinner table. Although I think our children would argue that that certainly wasn't an advantage. So, back to my PhD. The purpose of my work was to look at the outcomes which had been proposed as performance indicators, such as graduate achievement, student completion rates, and so on, and explore what factors or university inputs explained these outcomes. And it's really a simple higher education production function. And again, I've seen the almost identical schematic on slides today at the conference. The underlying premise of the work was that outputs cannot be examined in isolation from inputs such as students, staff, facilities, and subject mix. In the event, much of the inter-university variation in outcomes, not surprisingly, could be explained by corresponding variations in inputs. And so, simply by looking at individual outputs or at processes, those measuring performance were ignoring really important information, and that was the starting point. So I've spent much of my career in developing methods for constructing performance indicators which take into account the complex and multidimensional relationships. And I started out actually in 1996 by using principal components analysis to try and reflect the multiple dimensions. And that work, published in 1996 in European Journal of Operational Research, drew the attention of one Professor William Cooper, who, by writing a letter to me in 1996, it seems a bit strange thinking it was a letter, there were no emails at that stage, and so this letter came through to me, and it focused me on a relatively new frontier estimation methodology, namely data envelopment analysis. And so my journey was fixed along the frontier estimation path, and I've applied and developed DEA methodology and subsequently stochastic frontier analysis throughout my career. So I hope that answers the question.
What are the key policy developments in UK higher education over the period you have been working?
Yeah, it's a big question, that, actually. If we start in the late 1980s, had been all about trying to construct measures of performance motivated by the government calling for development of performance indicators in their Green Paper in 1985. And then the leaders in higher education, the vice-chancellors, also called for performance indicators with the Jarrett report, which was also published in 1985. The research assessment exercise was introduced in 1986, and this was the first attempt at assessing the quality and quantity of research produced by UK universities, and I'll talk more about that process and especially its successor, the Research Excellence Framework, later. But the 1990s saw two significant changes in UK higher education. The first was the 1992 Higher Education Act, which saw the abolition of the binary divide between universities and the more vocational polytechnics, with many more higher education institutions being awarded university status, and thereby increasing the capacity of the university sector. The second main policy initiative in the 1990s was the Deering Report of 1997, and that recommended the introduction of student-paid tuition fees. Initially set at £1,000 per annum for an undergraduate course, tuition fees were subsequently introduced into the UK in 1998, with loans available to students to cover both fees and, ultimately, maintenance. This policy shift meant that the UK was firmly on the road to altering its approach to higher education funding, from one of almost entirely being subsidised by the taxpayer to a cost-sharing approach, with students paying a higher portion of the costs than hitherto. So the change in cost sharing of higher education from public to private sources was actually typically observed in higher education sectors around the world from the 1980s, although the extent varied. Cost sharing, as we know, is a way of increasing the total pot of funding for universities whilst maintaining or reducing those public contributions, and there are various reasons for this switch. Since there are both public and private returns to people studying at university, ideology does suggest that maybe the costs should be shared. But also the expansion of higher education from being an elite system to one serving the masses required funding from more sources than just the public purse. And so private funding, as well as productivity and efficiency savings, the whole topic of our conference, they all became crucial. A common approach to switching away from public funding, and that adopted in England, was a move to the introduction of tuition fees for students, accompanied by access to loans to pay for the fees and maintenance. And the cost journey in England continued as fees rose to £3,000 in 2006, as you can see on the slide there. And it's worth just taking a moment to note that following devolution in the UK in 1999 to its four constituent parts, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, the higher education fee regimes subsequently differed across the devolved regions. And so from now on, I'll be referring to England rather than the UK. 1999 was also a big year for higher education because the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, set a target of 50% of young adults to enter higher education during the 2000s. To put this in perspective, at the start of this century, overall participation in higher education was around 33%. Obviously, that was higher than the 4% of the 1960s, but still quite a way off the 50% target pledged by Tony Blair. And of course, the start of the 21st century was also a crucial point for higher education in Spain and many other European countries, as represented by delegates at this conference, following, as it did, sign up to the Bologna process in 1999, and the subsequent push for quality teaching and excellent research in Spain and the rest of Europe was reinforced by this process. So the 50% target, combined with rising tuition fees, resulted in increasing marketisation and competition in the English higher education sector, with greater rivalry amongst institutions for students and funding. And this further heightened the emphasis on efficiency and performance, as universities needed to demonstrate their quality and value for money to attract students and to remain financially viable. The publication of the Brown Review, or the Brown Report, in 2010 followed the 2008 global economic crisis, and the accompanying pressure on funding, public funding, felt around the world. And we've heard a bit about that in one of the papers today in relation to Spain. In England, undergraduate student fees rose to the unprecedented level in 2012 of £9,000. Following which the university sector enjoyed a period of growth as they were keen to maximise their revenues from home undergraduate student recruitment. And the sector headed quite quickly towards the 50% target. Rising tuition fees for undergraduates, there was another rise in 2017 to £9,250, further led to England being highly marketised, with students perceiving themselves to be customers or consumers. In addition, loan systems were introduced for domestic students at both master's level in 2016 and doctoral level in 2019. Thus, the policy changes in the English higher education sector have probably produced the most marketised of European higher education sectors. But in Spain too, the Royal Decree Law of 2012 permitted increases in fees to reduce pressures on public spending too, leading to perceptions of increasing marketisation here. although I believe that fees in Spain public universities remain considerably lower than those in England. And in 2017, the UK published its industrial strategy. And this is worthy of mention here because of the point it clearly makes about the role of universities in stimulating economic growth by partnering with industry. And you can see a small excerpt there from the industrial strategy that we should be turning the ideas produced by our universities into products and services which will build our future industries. So universities will motivate innovation in our industries. And so just to summarise then, we come to the functions or missions of universities. The development of performance indicators had, prior to this time, really focused on what might be considered to be the two main missions, namely teaching and research. But here, the government, with the industrial strategy, the government is making it very clear that it sees universities to have a third mission, namely knowledge exchange, and I'll come on to that topic later. So the 2010s ended with the publication of the Auger report, which made potentially far-reaching recommendations. And of particular note, universities should increase the provision of courses aligned with the needs of the economy and reduce courses which demonstrate poor retention, poor graduate employability, and poor long-term earnings benefits. Universities needed to make more efficiency savings, and the maximum fee should be reduced to £7,500, and more graduates should repay their loans in full. On top of these recommendations, the sector, of course, was hit by Brexit in 2020, with implications for research funding and European student fees, which were no longer fixed to home fees. In the event, the COVID pandemic intervened and the Auger recommendations, as well as probably the full impact of Brexit, were delayed. However, an overhaul of the repayment system has now been introduced, and there are moves to put student number caps on low-performing courses. Like higher education sectors around the world, English universities have been impacted by the COVID pandemic with a rapid move to online delivery, engendering skills in academics which are already being employed in developing online programs to contribute to further income generation. For England, the pandemic resulted in the removal of the domestic student numbers cap that each university had previously had. The student numbers cap was a restriction imposed by the government on the maximum number of domestic students a university could take. Without that restriction, the more highly ranked universities have been recruiting students beyond their normal numbers to maximise revenues, and other universities are struggling to attract home students as a consequence and needing to diversify their portfolio. The pandemic, combined with Brexit and its impact on European student numbers, have only accelerated competition in English higher education and have perpetuated the search for alternative income streams, such as recruiting increasing numbers of overseas students, and also now working much more closely with external organisations and businesses to provide support to them through consultancy, research and professional development. In short, universities have expanded third mission activities to take advantage of those accompanying income streams. These impacts, combined with the introduction of performance measurements in the context of knowledge exchange, have made third mission of universities increasingly important in England. Throughout this whole period, the English higher education sector has been subject to increasing performance measurement. We've already seen that measurement of performance in research was introduced in 1986. Similar assessments of teaching excellence were introduced in 2017, and of knowledge exchange in 2021, and I'll come back to those later.
What are the key research findings over this period?
Yes, well, alongside that vast array of policy developments and implementation, I and a lot of people in this room and a lot of previous attendees at this particular series of workshops have aimed to inform those policies. The main recommendations that I would draw out are that any attempt to measure performance in universities should take a value-added approach, ensuring that those inputs into the process are taken into account when assessing the value of the output. It's unambiguously important, but I think it is particularly so if resources are to be allocated based on those performance measures. But in calculating value added, universities really should be treated as multi-product firms using multiple inputs. And the multi-input, multi-output nature of university production, and that includes quality as well as quantity of both inputs used and outputs produced, should be explicitly taken into account. Moreover, since performance measures typically rely on estimation of production or cost functions, the estimation methods should allow for the frontier nature of these functions, hence DEA or stochastic frontier analysis or the derived methods from those. Following on from this, underperforming universities should be able to identify appropriate benchmark institutions, those which have similar missions to their own, in order to identify ways in which they can improve their own performance. It's also important to account for the diversity of higher education institutions when making comparisons of performance. The estimation method and the approach, whether it's cost or production, should accommodate diversity. Performance evaluations based on groupings of comparable universities are likely to be more meaningful than performance evaluations based on individual rankings. And a clearer understanding of the production mechanisms, such as economies of scale and scope, complementarities of outputs or substitutability of inputs, are all crucial to policy determination. And I would also just like to pick up on the multi-product nature of university activities and just take a moment to look more closely at the university missions. There's now widespread agreement that universities have three main functions, all revolving around knowledge creation, which we traditionally call research, knowledge transmission, which we would refer to as teaching, and knowledge exchange, or the application of knowledge in wider society. And in fact, these three missions are exactly the three pillars of universities referred to in the recent 2023 Organic Law of the University System in Spain. All universities here and elsewhere should be involved in all three missions, although the degree to which they are pursued does vary from university to university. And in England, the three missions are acknowledged by the approaches to performance assessment, which have gathered momentum over recent years.
How has university performance in these three areas of research, teaching, and knowledge exchange been measured in practice in UK higher education?
Okay, well, if I go through them one by one in the order that they're on the screen there, research, then teaching, then knowledge exchange. So in England, as well as all the devolved nations in the UK, we have implemented a research excellence framework, which happens every 5 years or so, and started with that research assessment excellence research assessment exercise in 1986. REF assesses the quality and quantity of each university's research, and an element of funding known as quality-related or QR funding is subsequently awarded to universities on the basis of those results. Now, the REF approach has evolved over time because it's been going so long, and it's largely well understood, at least in the UK. And if I just say a little bit about the most recent REF, the results of which were announced in 2022, it operated as follows. It was overseen and undertaken by the 4 UK higher education funding bodies relating to the 4 devolved governments. And the REF aimed to encourage a dynamic and world-class research base by providing accountability and producing evidence relating to public investment in research, and by applying a transparent methodology with results available for all to see, leading to the possibility to benchmark subsequently. Now, the REF was a process of expert review undertaken by expert panels for each of 34 disciplines or units of assessment, UOAs. Overseeing and guiding this process were 4 main high-level panels, and expert panels were comprised of senior academics, international experts, and research users. Each university made submissions to their own chosen UOAs. It might be all 34 if they had research in all 34 areas. And 3 distinct elements were assessed. The first was the quality of outputs, and by that, certainly in the business context, we mean publications. The second was the impact of their research beyond academia. And the third was the research environment supporting each UOA's research. And to derive an overall assessment of a UOA, these 3 elements were combined with a priori weightings of 60% for publications, or for outputs, I should say, 25% for impact, and 15% for research environment. And ratings were assigned on the basis of 4-star, which was the highest you could get, down to 1-star and unclassified. Conducting a REF-type assessment is a substantial and time-consuming exercise, as you might imagine, but just to give you a bit of a feel for what it took, in the last REF, there were 1,878 submissions by UK universities and assessed by the 34 subpanels, and the outcome of the exercise was a summary overview for each UOA in each university. Results are available for all to see on the REF website in the form of a dashboard, which is actually extremely easy to use. So what do we think about the REF? Well, on the positive side, it's comprehensive, it's reasonably well understood, and it has a results dashboard which is really easy to interpret and which facilitates comparisons. So individual institutions can undertake their own benchmarking as they see fit. And what I've just put on the slide there are the graphs, just a snapshot of the output for my own school, actually my own UOA at Huddersfield. You can see it's very visual. You've got the graph showing you the amount of 4-star, 3-star, 2-star, etc. outputs, impact case studies, and environment. That's a small bit of the output, and you can download the whole database if you really want to. And you can obtain that for every subject at every university. However, there is no high-level guidance on appropriately benchmarking results on the basis of, for example, the university's inputs, and so league tables of universities based on these research results can easily be calculated and presented without reference to appropriate benchmark information, and frequently is done. A small but not insubstantial portion of funding is linked to the REF. Now, the precise amount varies not just on your REF results, and it goes to 4-star and 3-star rated research, but it also varies by subject mix, with universities heavily involved in medicine and science, technology and engineering, receiving more than those with less emphasis in those areas. And an important aspect of REF is that external expert opinion about UK universities is probably formed, at least in part, from REF results, and this can subsequently impact on rankings such as QS, where the expert opinion is very heavily weighted. So that's REF. The next one is TEF, which is, I think, Carmen, you always find this quite a complicated framework to follow, and it hasn't been helped by the fact that the most recent results were published 3 weeks ago, and the approach to TEF has actually changed since its first introduction in 2017. So TEF was published for the first time in England in June 2017 and covered a variety of outcomes relating to teaching activity. I'm not going to go into the detail of those particular outcomes at this stage, but the most important point of TEF then was that it related each outcome to a benchmark value, which was quite interesting. So the TEF ratings measured whether a university exceeded, met, or was below expectations based on the profile of their students and the subject taught. And this made TEF very distinctive from REF. Now, the benchmarks were derived in a very complicated manner. If you're familiar with the shift-share approach, it was very similar to the shift-share approach. But the results of the latest TEF exercise were published only 3 weeks ago, and while the general approach of TEF 2023 had some significant differences when compared to the 2017 version, that benchmarking remained a central theme that remained in the TEF. Now, the main differences were that the ratings that you could get, gold, silver, and bronze, were supplemented by an additional rating of requires improvement. Gold, silver, and bronze is quite interesting. That was used the first time in 2017. And I'm told, I don't know whether this is true, that when somebody was devising the TEF, it was when the UK was hosting the Olympics, and hence gold, silver, and bronze became the awards for the TEF. In 2017, there was only a single rating. You either got gold, silver, or bronze, and that was it. But in 2023, the single overall rating has been replaced by 3 separate ratings, one relating to student outcomes, one relating to student experience, and an overall one that combines those 2 previous aspects. And the judgments are made on the basis of a variety of metrics relating to student outcomes and experience, just as they were in 2017. But these are supplemented by 2 narrative statements, one from the provider itself and one from the provider's students. The metrics and the statements are assessed by an expert panel, with the metrics themselves contributing no more than half the evidence to the rating, and that's quite different from 2017, which were almost entirely metrics-driven. As you can see, of the 228 providers assessed, only 46 got an overall gold rating. By far, the vast majority are silver. And you'll notice a pink area there with 53 universities, and these are currently being re-examined because those institutions have appealed their award, and so they are being re-looked at, and they will be announced in November. So the consequence is that TEF 2023 is a very much more sophisticated exercise than the one that took place in 2017. The 3 aspects make it much more finely grained, but the importance of the narratives make it much more responsive to the ways in which different providers deliver their very diverse missions. In other words, diversity is accommodated through the subjective judgment of narratives, and providers with an overall gold rating, for example, might have achieved that in very different ways, as this diagram aims to show. If you look at the left-hand side of the diagram, this particular one here, that's your 26 gold providers. 46 gold providers. 26 of those actually got gold on the 2 other aspects as well. But 13 got gold on student experience, but silver on student outcomes, and the remaining 7 were silver on student experience, but gold on student outcomes. Even more diversity can be seen if you look at the overall silver and bronze providers. Although the TEF isn't linked directly to the distribution of teaching-related funds, as some of the funds for research are, it is indirectly related to funding in a number of ways. From 2019, holding a TEF award in England permitted institutions to charge the maximum £9,250 fee. And the TEF dashboard is clearly aimed at giving potential students full information to choose a university with the best teaching quality in their subject, as measured by TEF. So on the positive side, I think the use of benchmarking is welcomed and definitely to be applauded, although the methodology is somewhat complex for the layperson to understand. The high-level awards are simple to interpret, but the detailed results dashboard, whilst ostensibly facilitating comparisons, is really hard to understand, especially for the target audience. And I've just, again, taken a small snapshot from Huddersfield. This is what you would get if you looked up this institution, and you can see that the benchmarks are there with the confidence intervals that around the benchmarks that you can work out on each of those perspectives how the university is performing. So I don't think it's a particularly user-friendly dashboard for the target audience. So, on to the third mission, knowledge exchange. The introduction of the knowledge exchange framework, or KEF, in England has made third mission activities much more prominent in all universities as the framework attempts to measure success and performance across the sector. Knowledge exchange pertains to sharing research with end users, including businesses, public and third sector organisations, as well as the wider community, and thereby maximising research impact. In other words, KEF measures the way in which a provider engages with and brings value to the world outside of academia, potentially contributing to economic growth, productivity, and levelling up. KEF, first published in 2021 and renewed each year, is an attempt to measure universities' performance on this third mission activity. It derives metrics on a range of 7 activities, 7 perspectives, and each one of those 7 perspectives has its own metrics. Unlike the REF, where all universities are compared without reference to any interinstitutional differences in mission, and TEF, where university-specific benchmarks are calculated on given criteria, in the KEF, universities are actually grouped at the start into clusters which are assumed to have similar missions. And so you can see the map here of the different clusters, 7 clusters in all. My own university is in Cluster E, which is a very diverse portfolio for the university. And you can see from that as well that it's only England or English institutions that participate in KEF. Anyway, no cluster is considered superior to any other, and then the results are presented as quintile scores in the context of the cluster to ensure that comparisons are made between like-for-like institutions. So there are no league tables, there are no rankings, and perhaps because of this, KEF results don't receive the publicity and the scrutiny that the other frameworks do. Like the REF and the TEF, the information for KEF is reported in the form of a dashboard, which is available for absolutely anybody to see, and you can download every single bit of data if you would like to do so. Just to give you a flavour of that then again for my own university, you can see the seven perspectives on the left-hand side. The green is the university's performance. The green blocks are the university's performance on those 7 perspectives. A lighter colour green relates to better performance. Dark green is worse performance. And the blue bar is the average quintile result for the cluster. So you can easily see if you're above the cluster performance or below it. If you click on any one of those perspectives, you can get the detailed metrics that underpin that perspective. And so what is shown on the slide here on the right-hand side is the underlying metrics for the working with business perspective. And so this means that providers can assess their performance in detail against the benchmark group. And it's also possible to download a lot of narrative information about mission and vision. So that is the three excellence frameworks for three missions in the UK.
Very good. In Spain, we don't have any experience of such frameworks. It would be interesting to know how these policy changes and performance exercises have impacted UK universities in terms of university sector efficiency, of course, but in terms of university income, funding, what is the situation now after that? Equity of access, because we speak all the time about efficiency, but we need to know the equity of access. And finally, my new subject, which is university governance.
Yeah, okay. In terms of sector efficiency, I'm actually going to come back to that right at the very end, because I think that's an area that has been very under-researched, the impact of the frameworks on efficiency in the university sector. And interestingly, Christoph gave a paper earlier today, which I will refer back to at that point, because I don't think that we actually have a terrific amount of evidence in that area. So if we consider, first of all, how performance assessment frameworks actually align with those research recommendations that we've been making over the years, if we have a look at that first then, within the multidimensional production context of universities is acknowledged to a limited extent, but only within each individual framework, each of which collects data on a variety of variables in the given context, whether it's research, teaching, or knowledge exchange. There's no effort to acknowledge that performance in one of the three areas might be impacted by a university's activities in either of the other two areas. Each activity is examined in isolation from the others. The frontier methodological approaches of our research, such as DEA and SFA, are not considered in any of these frameworks, yet the chosen methodologies are often no less complex than those that have been avoided. And the methods don't have the advantage offered by the frontier methodologies of easily accommodating the synergies of joint production whilst allowing for diversity. And I think it's actually quite odd that our frameworks have avoided frontier estimation methods in English higher education, as they're routinely used in, for example, energy regulation in Europe to set revenue caps for transmission and distribution system operators. And DEA also underpins a publicly available school performance dashboard in Portugal, which permits the benchmarking of Portuguese secondary schools. Now, whether the lack of adoption of frontier estimation techniques matters is largely unknown, and a study that I did with a colleague in Australia, which was published last year or so, compares the results of TEF in 2017 with the results of a network DEA using the absolutely identical data. The graph on the slide reassuringly suggests a positive relationship between the TEF 2017 awards and the efficiency scores, but as you can see, it's a very imprecise relationship, and I think probably it does need further exploration, just how important it is that frontier methods are not being used. But it is reassuring to see that benchmarking and diversity are increasingly acknowledged in these more recent frameworks, works such as TEF and KEF. So, income sources, university income sources, and the effect on the portfolio of a university's activities. Well, cost sharing, as I remarked earlier, it has changed radically in the UK and in England over the last few years. And it's encouraged universities to seek out new funding sources and to diversify their income streams. The figure on the slide shows the sources of income for English universities since 1994. And I think the most standout observation there is the switch in source of income from funding council grants, essentially government, which is the dark blue line, to fees, which is the orange line, which increasingly since 1998 has been from the students themselves, of course. England has ostensibly seen a big shift away from government to private funding, which is seen here. However, I think the relevant word there is ostensibly, as the status of graduate debt repayment is such that in fact a considerable portion of these fees will ultimately be paid by the government. Of the full-time undergraduates starting in 2022-23, the government expects only around 27% to repay their loan in full. But with new funding rules set to come in force following the Augar recommendations for students starting this academic year, this percentage should rise to 61%. But perhaps linked to the non-repayment just referenced, the link between course take-up and quality of provision as measured by TEF metrics has not had the desired effect of deterring new students from starting courses deemed to be of poor quality. And as such, in July 2023, the government announced that there will be caps on the student numbers on courses deemed to be failing. So what does this look like in a particular university? It will be different for every single university. The sector level data presented on that previous slide conceals some interesting patterns observed within an individual institution. And as Dean of Huddersfield Business School from 2016 to earlier this year, I've been ideally placed to see the impact of the development of high-level performance indicators and accompanying funding regimes on an individual university, and specifically a school within that institution. Such is the higher education context that individual universities absolutely have to be fleet of foot in responding to the opportunities and diversifying their activities to find alternative income streams as needed. So, as can be seen on this slide, the University of Huddersfield experienced the same switch from government funding to student-paid tuition fees as the sector as a whole. But what's also clear is the growth in income here relating to research, which is the grey segment. This particular segment encompasses a vast array of income sources, ranging from traditional research council grants through to income from working with industry and the public and charity sectors, i.e. some knowledge exchange and third mission areas. And this is sufficiently important that research income has grown from 2% in the first year presented here, 2006-07, to 8% of income for the university in 21-22. This is no accident at all. The University of Huddersfield has had a clear strategy map with 6 broad themes, and as part of the innovative theme, schools within the university must aim for very challenging targets on both research and knowledge exchange income, on creating formal links with businesses, on producing publications with end users, and on winning knowledge transfer partnerships. The university has therefore made it a strategic imperative to expand its research and knowledge exchange activities, with the consequent impact that we can see on the income streams. The industrial strategy introduced in 2017 also introduced some really generously financed opportunities for universities, and this diversification of activity away from the more traditional areas seen at Huddersfield and elsewhere is deliberate, and it's absolutely crucial for maintaining the financial viability of a university such as Huddersfield. And it's led to innovations at Huddersfield, such as the creation of the 3M Buckley Innovation Centre. This was set up in 2013. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of the university which aims to facilitate business growth, encourage business to academia collaboration, and actively promote innovation. And alongside that, we've got initiatives such as the annual publication of what we call the Kirklees Top 100 companies listing. Kirklees is the Huddersfield area, and this creates links with our local business community and leads very definitely to future income streams. Now, Carmen, you were particularly interested in how the policy changes have impacted equity of opportunity for students. And one concern raised by opponents of cost sharing is that it discourages equity in higher education. I don't have enough time to do justice to this topic, and it's not my own specific area of research, but I've just dug out a few graphs for us to look at. There is research that I can report on that has shown that England, following tuition fee hikes in 2012, has found that older students and those studying part-time have been detrimentally impacted. And the chart I show here relates to ethnicity. And you can look at progression rates, the progression from school into university for your examination. On this particular graph that's on the screen at the moment, we can see that there's been a steady increase in progression rates for all ethnicities, but the gap isn't, it's neither getting any better nor getting any worse. Perhaps of more interest is the graph that I've got here, which looks at progression rates by eligibility for free school meals. So this is a reflection of deprivation or socio-economic status, if you like. The gap, what is reported here is the gap in the progression rate between students who were eligible for free school meals and students who were not. The higher the gap, the more the inequality between the two groups. And I've also tried to bring in a geographical aspect, but we'll come on to that in a moment. So looking first at the blue lines, which represent the gap for England as a whole, we can see that it seemed to be on a downward trend until 2013 or so, but it has actually been steadily increasing since, and the latest data shows the gap to be over 20%. I think the fact that the downward trend started to rise after 2013 is actually quite interesting because, of course, the fee hike to £9,000 happened in 2012. Now, the red lines relate to one particular location in England, and it's the Yorkshire and Humber region, which is the area in which I'm located. And we see that the gap is much higher than for England as a whole, and we can see actually that it's remaining stubbornly at 20% and above. There's little sign of any decrease in this particular gap. And I think this has real implications for such initiatives as the government's levelling up agenda. And we'll revert to the theme of geographical inequalities later on. But I'll just end here then, as you asked, with some thoughts around governance and the impact of the policy changes. Not so much on governance as more specifically an area that I've done research on, which is Vice-Chancellor's remuneration. So I think it's probably worth commenting on the changing role and rewards of university leaders, which we call Vice-Chancellors, throughout the period that we've been looking at. The VC in the UK is appointed by the institution's council, which is the governing body for the university, comprising independent external members. Unlike in Spain and other European countries where the rector is often elected for a fixed term, there is no fixed term for the job in a UK university. The VC's salary is set by the Remuneration Committee, and that is a subcommittee of council. I think it's safe to say that in the 1980s, appointments of VCs were typically based on academic track record, and the governing body typically made the strategic decisions while the VC delivered the strategy. But the subsequent marketisation of higher education in the UK has really altered the role of the VC, as changing policies and funding regimes mean that universities increasingly face considerable complexities and pressures. The VC is now very much the strategic and executive leader, and while the VC normally has at least some academic background, many also have business experience. So the changing nature of the VC role, combined with the international nature of the labour market from which VCs are appointed, mean that their level of pay inevitably relates more to private sector CEO pay than academic remuneration, as can be seen in the figure on the slide. So the graph there is taken directly from the paper and shows a steady increase in VC remuneration over time. The table is a snapshot from the most recent publication of VC pay in the UK, and you can see that the most highly paid VC is getting almost £750,000, which is a not insubstantial amount of money. But there are plenty there getting over £400,000 per annum.
And they are ladies.
Sorry?
They are ladies.
Yes.
The two first.
Yes. And the earlier work that I did on VC pay, I was trying to link it to university efficiency, but it wasn't. I couldn't get it to be related. There seemed to be no relationship between VC pay and managerial performance as measured by a DEA measure, but there did seem to be a relationship between the pay and university rankings, which might be perceived to indicate university reputation. And perhaps that's an area that could be usefully explored later.
Oh, sorry. Finally, where should we be focusing our research next in the future?
Well, aside from the points that I've made as I've gone through the slides, I felt that in reviewing the research in the efficiency field and the impact of our work and accompanying recommendations on policy developments over the last decades, I felt that there were a number of really quite big gaps that we could be addressing. First of all, what is not yet clear is just how the introduction and implementation of the assessment frameworks have affected subsequent efficiency and performance. Nor has the introduction of performance-based funding mechanisms been properly explored in the English context, at least. And there is so much data. The considerable data available make this a really obvious area for research. And I'm confident that we could do this after listening to Christoph's talk earlier. He showed how to combine insights from efficiency and policy evaluation. And to quote you, Christoph, you ended by saying, more resources do not always lead to better efficiency. And I think that the performance-based funding is an obvious area where we should actually be testing out whether it is the case that awarding higher funding to apparently more highly performing universities does lead to greater efficiency, and we should be looking into that more carefully. I think that the introduction and implementation of REF, TEF and KEF as separate isolated exercises assumes that there are few, if any, spillovers between the three activities, which is itself, I think, an area for future research. While multiple inputs and outputs are assumed within each activity, there's no consideration of the multiple inputs and outputs across the three activities. The existing approach views the three areas that we saw earlier of mission as distinct, with perhaps research and teaching as the core activities and third mission often on the periphery. This view is one which contradicts the idea of the civic university, which has the underpinning premise that there's no core and periphery, but that the three activities are intertwined, and there is a virtuous circle from engaging in all three together rather than pursuing each one separately. Indeed, perhaps we could go even further and say that universities don't have three separate missions, but one single mission relating to the pursuit of knowledge, human as opposed to artificial, whether that's creation, transmission, or exchange. As such, any efficiency analysis should incorporate metrics from the frameworks relating to all three knowledge-related activities. So we're back to the original schematic here of university production, represented right at the start, and which I used all those years ago as the base in my PhD. By considering all university activities in a much more holistic framework, we could explore substitutabilities, complementarities, and derive estimates of economies of scale, economies of scope, and these could permit exploration of further opportunities for increasing productivity or efficiency, both of which are crucially important when we're trying to fund higher education for the masses. But this ignores two really important topics where I really do think there needs to be more research. The first relates to the impact of universities on their communities or regions. There's been little research dedicated to the effect of universities on regions in England or the UK, although I know that there is work in other countries, including Spain. Our traditional models of university production and hence performance measurement don't really incorporate these effects. Even with a small but compelling evidence base from outside the UK demonstrating that universities positively impact their local regions, external benefits from university activities are usually omitted from any performance assessment or efficiency analysis. So let's properly incorporate these externalities. They're important. And we should not focus on achieving efficiency to the possible detriment of social equity. If, for example, a policy such as that recently announced in England relating to the closure of certain non-performing courses results in a reduction of a university's activities in a particular area of expertise, this could have a really detrimental effect on the local and regional economies. Such effects are rarely, if ever, taken into account in English university efficiency studies, and I hold my hand up to that because I have never incorporated them, and so I would challenge researchers to consider them in future studies of university performance. And again, I'm quite optimistic. I've heard work presented at this conference this afternoon incorporating equity at a school level, and so we need to transfer this to the university level. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, an area where there's a dearth of research to date relates to the issue of environmental impact of higher education activity. And this is surely a gap which should be examined much more closely. Activities of academics in all areas, and particularly the scientific, engineering, and medical disciplines, inevitably have environmental impacts. The flow of international students and of academics on business, us coming here to the conference, for example, all have a carbon footprint. And of course, there are environmental impacts of the whole operation of an organisation such as a university. Mapping out the carbon emissions of a single university is really not easy at all, and it's even harder to get a picture for the whole sector. But best estimates suggest that the carbon footprint for the whole of tertiary education in the UK, and this includes further as well as higher education, is 18.1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. The figure could be almost triple if the institution's pensions and investments were included. And of this total, higher education institutions were responsible for 86%. And this works out at 6.3 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per student in a typical year, just from the university's operations. And if we look at the chart that I've just put on the screen, the biggest source of emissions was embedded in the supply chain for the sector at over 36%. But the built environment, or the estate, contributed a substantial 19%, while travel and transport, including students' flights, students and staff commuting, and business travel, well, that amounted to 24% of the total. Recent work examining sustainability practices in Spanish public and private universities concludes that while sustainability is recognised as important, it's not fully embedded in the systems, strategies, activities or policies of universities in Spain. And I have no doubt that this is true for all other countries too. Thus, our production and efficiency models should include the bad outputs of university production, such as those carbon emissions. So conferences and workshops such as these, which focus on efficiency in university and other public sectors, have huge opportunity to contribute to the improvements of operations in these sectors. This series of workshops, as I said this morning, started in Thessaloniki in 2013, and two leaders in the efficiency and productivity research field, Shauna Grosskopf and Rolf Fair, spoke at that event. We were very lucky to have them there. From that very first workshop in 2013, I've always been impressed by the calibre of the research presented and the number and quality of PhD and early career researchers working on important topics. And so given my full retirement from academia in the coming months, this is the last conference, sadly, that I will be attending, but I'll take with me many memories of colleagues and collaborators sitting here in the room that I've been fortunate to meet and work with over the years. I wish everybody the very best with their research endeavours, and I very much hope that the academics' work spanning the next 5 decades feeds into and informs the future policy agendas. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your inspiring presentation, Jill. You say a lot of new ideas and a lot of handwork for the efficiency community. And well, I would like to say or to focus on your last idea, because you are thinking in one mission at the university. What do you think, how to introduce that in the DIA and efficiency analysis?
I think a lot of the presentations and the work that I read focuses on one particular aspect, just as the frameworks do actually, whether that's research or whether that's teaching. Sometimes we're lucky and it's research and teaching, but I'm not sure that I've seen any that have research, teaching and knowledge exchange satisfactorily incorporated in those studies. And I think certainly in England, with the data that are available through all those frameworks, there is huge opportunity to put all that data together and do a big mapping of all 3 activities together.
Fully agree. Any question? Comments? Reflections? Christoph?
Thank you very much, Jill, for this inspiring keynote. It's a very nice overview that you gave, and yeah, impressive work. So I think it's very nice. I was wondering a little bit about the TEF, the CAF, and the REF.
Yes.
you can see a little bit the differences between the ref. So there is just the ranking very
Yep.
clearly.
Yep.
Then in the TEF, it goes with confidence intervals, and then
Yep.
in the CAV, it's really like very
Clusters.
unclear. Given your background as both a researcher and a dean, I was wondering, how do you judge that? Because you said yourself, so TEF is probably less used, probably because of the confidence intervals.
Yeah.
But at the same time, of course, we know that there is no real ranking and there is a huge overlap.
Yes.
So how would you judge, given your
Yeah.
bipolar nature as a dean and a researcher, what
Yeah.
would you recommend now to use?
I actually quite like KEF.
So the one that is not used.
Sorry?
The one that is not used.
The one that is not getting the headlines, yes, because it has those clusters and it makes the comparisons within the clusters. The only thing that I would say is I wouldn't necessarily create the clusters beforehand. We know that there are methodologies where we could use the data to both derive efficiency and create the latent classes or the clusters at the same time. So I wouldn't necessarily use the same methodology, but I do like the idea of using clusters. I think TEF, I think it's very laudable, the idea of trying to use benchmarking and above or below expectations. But I think, again, I wouldn't use the methodology that is used in TEF, which I actually think is really very complicated.
Any other question? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
To the Foundation and, of course, to Jill Jones for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.